1 Kings, chapter 7, verse 1. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. Verse 2. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon 100 cubits long, 50 wide and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. Verse 3. It was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns. 45 beams, 15 to a row. Verse 4. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3, facing each other. Verse 5. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front part in sets of 3, facing each other. Verse 6. He made a colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 wide. In front of it was a portico, and in front of that were pillars and an overhanging roof. Verse 7. He built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. Verse 8. And the palace in which he was to live, set farther back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. Verse 9. All these structures, from the outside to the great courtyard and from foundation to eaves, were made of blocks of high-grade stone cut to size and smoothed on their inner and outer faces. Verse 10. The foundations were laid with large stones of good quality, some measuring 10 cubits and some 8. The foundations were laid with large stones of good quality, some measuring 10 cubits and some 8. Verse 11. Above were high-grade stones, cut to size, and cedar beams. Verse 12. The great courtyard was surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portico. Verse 13. King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram. Verse 14. Whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and whose father was from Tyre and a skilled craftsman in bronze. Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding and with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. Verse 15. He cast 2 bronze pillars, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. Verse 16. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. Each capital was 5 cubits high. Verse 17. A network of interwoven chains adorned the capitals on top of the pillars, 7 for each capital. Verse 18. He made pomegranates in 2 rows encircling each network to decorate the capitals on top of the pillars. He did the same for each capital. He made pomegranates in 2 rows encircling each network to decorate the capitals on top of the pillars. He did the same for each capital. Verse 19. The capitals on top of the pillars in the portico were in the shape of lilies, 4 cubits high. Verse 20. On the capitals of both pillars, above the bowl-shaped part next to the network, were the 200 pomegranates in rows all around. Verse 21. He erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillar to the south he named Jachin and the one to the north Boaz. He erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillar to the south he named Jachin and the one to the north Boaz. Verse 22. The capitals on top were in the shape of lilies, and so the work on the pillars was completed. Verse 23. He made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. Verse 24. Below the rim, gourds encircled it, 10 to a cubit. The gourds were cast in 2 rows in one piece with the sea. Verse 25. The sea stood on 12 bulls, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south and 3 facing east. The sea rested on top of them, and their hindquarters were toward the center. Verse 26. It was a handbreadth in thickness, and its rim was like the rim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It held 2,000 baths. It was a handbreadth in thickness, and its rim was like the rim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It held 2,000 baths. Verse 27. He also made 10 movable stands of bronze. Each was 4 cubits long, 4 wide and 3 high. Verse 28. This is how the stands were made. They had side panels attached to uprights. Verse 29. On the panels between the uprights were lions, bulls and cherubim, and on the uprights as well. Above and below the lions and bulls were wreaths of hammered work. Verse 30. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles, and each had a basin resting on 4 supports, cast with wreaths on each side. Verse 31. On the inside of the stand there was an opening that had a circular frame 1 cubit deep. This opening was round, and with its basework it measured 1.5 cubits. Around its opening there was engraving. The panels of the stands were square, not round. On the inside of the stand there was an opening that had a circular frame 1 cubit deep. This opening was round, and with its basework it measured 1.5 cubits. Around its opening there was engraving. The panels of the stands were square, not round. Verse 32. The 4 wheels were under the panels, and the axles of the wheels were attached to the stand. The diameter of each wheel was 1.5 cubits. Verse 33. The wheels were made like chariot wheels. The axles, rims, spokes and hubs were all of cast metal. Verse 34. Each stand had 4 handles, 1 on each corner, projecting from the stand. Verse 35. At the top of the stand there was a circular band 0.5 cubit deep. The supports and panels were attached to the top of the stand. Verse 36. He engraved cherubim, lions and palm trees on the surfaces of the supports and on the panels, in every available space, with wreaths all around. Verse 37. This is the way he made the 10 stands. They were all cast in the same molds and were identical in size and shape. Verse 38. He then made 10 bronze basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 4 cubits across. 1 basin to go on each of the 10 stands. Verse 39. He placed 5 of the stands on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north. He placed the sea on the south side, at the southeast corner of the temple. Verse 40. He also made the pots and shovels and sprinkling bowls. So Huram finished all the work he had undertaken for King Solomon in the temple of the Lord. Verse 41. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 2 sets of network decorating the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars. Verse 42. The 400 pomegranates for the 2 sets of network. 2 rows of pomegranates for each network decorating the bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars. Verse 43. The 10 stands with their 10 basins. Verse 44. The sea and the 12 bulls under it. Verse 45. The pots, shovels and sprinkling bowls. All these objects that Huram made for King Solomon for the temple of the Lord were of burnished bronze. Verse 46. The king had them cast in clay molds in the plain of the Jordan between Succoth and Zarethan. Verse 47. Solomon left all these things unweighed, because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Verse 48. Solomon also made all the furnishings that were in the Lord's temple. The golden altar, the golden table on which was the bread of the presence. Verse 49. The lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right and 5 on the left. in front of the inner sanctuary. The gold floral work and lamps and tongs. Verse 50. The pure gold basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, dishes and censers, and the gold sockets for the doors of the innermost room, the most holy place, and also for the doors of the main hall of the temple. Verse 51. When all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple.